Dr. Amos Wilson.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and of course for inviting me here with you today. It's indeed always a pleasure to visit with you and share some time with you, and I'd like to encourage you to keep up the good work that you're doing here. I'm going to talk a little bit about the development of the black child, the retardation of that development, and its recreation. I don't expect to say anything new at this point, but basically just to reiterate some themes and maybe to encourage us to keep moving forward. Many of you who are in the audience, of course, have heard me talk about this subject time and time again, to talk about the development of our children, to indicate that our children are not just colored black duplicates of the white child. You've heard me talk about this child in its physical and mental growth, and to indicate that the physical and mental growth of the black child is in advance of that of the white child. You've heard me indicate that our children do things and exhibit behavior on their first day and second days of life that it takes the European child a month and a half or more to reach. I've indicated that among some 60 different measures of the mental and physical abilities of children, the black child stands well in advance of the European child. So the black child is not just a colored duplicate of the European child. I've indicated on a number of occasions, and those who've read the book, that the difference in the black child's development is such that this child requires a nutritional chart unique to its own development. That is, we cannot just go out and assume that what is nutritionally appropriate for the European child is nutritionally appropriate for the black child or the African child. This seems to be connected in many ways to, of course, the melanin in our bodies, and apparently the history and experience of black people and of African people, who were, from all scientific evidence, the first people to populate this earth. I've indicated that our children carry in their bodies the evolutionary history of black people. All of the political, social, and other decisions that black people have made over time are represented in the bodies of our children. The pioneering advancement of black people on this earth in the founding of civilizations, the founding of science, mathematics, and so forth, which you've heard a great deal of from Van Sertima, Ben Yochanan, and Dr. Clark, and many others, are represented in the black child's body and in the black child's mind. I often say I would like to think that the black child's talking first, walking first, showing social relationships first, its advanced development in terms of its brain and so forth, in some way recapitulates or repeats the pioneering efforts of black people on this earth. It's almost as if there's a repetition in the development of the black child of the early development of black people. Given the evidence of the advanced development of the black child, we really should not have any doubts about our capabilities as people, and yet there still is grave doubt. Given the history of our people, and of course we talk about Egyptian civilization, some of you are looking at the Van Sertima lecture there in terms of the influence of the African on Central American civilizations and so forth, and of course other Van Sertima publications that refer to the African presence in Europe and Asia and various other parts of the world. And of course the idea that at one point the continent of Africa was literally the center of the earth, this continent itself being at one point attached to Africa, Central and South America being a part of what we call today Africa, parts of Europe, of India, China, Australia, and so forth. So we see the black man at the very center of the world, and we see the black man as the civilizing influence in the world. That influence and these accomplishments, I believe, are still represented in our children and still represent our potential as people. The indication being that if we did it once, we can do it again. There is a psychologist, Jung, who talks about a collective unconscious and a racial unconscious, indicating that the racial experiences of a people does not die. It remains represented in the minds and bodies of a people, as well as the whole experience of mankind. So our children today carry in their bodies the racial and the experiences of mankind as such. Now the question often arises then, as it often arises when we read a book such as The Destruction of Black Civilization by Chancellor Williams. You know, and often you can start talking about the great black civilizations and so forth, and almost inevitably someone will ask the question, well, you know, if we were so great, what happened to us now? You know, why are we in the position? That's a very important question. Of course, the book, to a great extent, dedicates itself to answering that question or dealing with that question. I think it's one that we should meditate on a great deal. What did happen? How did we lose our civilizations? How did we lose our head starts? Again, when we look at the development of the black child, we must ask a similar question. Today we hear all types of things about our children's so-called inabilities to read, or poor reading scores, or high dropout rates, and so-called learning disabilities, and behavioral problems, and encounters with drugs, and one thing after another. And I'm sure we are prompted to ask the question then, in light of what I've said earlier, with all of these natural advancements of the black child, why is it that they have these troubles later? And I think we must look at that as a basis for correcting the situation that we find ourselves in today, and for dealing with the educational crisis that we find ourselves in here in New York City and basically the world over. In the struggles of nations and peoples for dominance and defense, one nation's or people's potentials must be retarded or reduced or destroyed or advantageously exploited by other nations and people. In other words, I think an unfortunate side of history is one where nations accomplish dominance and power by often destroying the potentials of other nations and other people, or by retarding the potentials, reducing those potentials, or distorting the potentials of the other nations. This, of course, has a long history in the history of mankind. The rise and fall of nations, the rise and fall of dominance by various peoples over other peoples. And this is usually accomplished either by a combination of factors such as internal problems within a dominant nation, making it subject then to overthrow by an uprising nation, or by an overwhelming alien force happening to overrun even a healthy nation. We then must look at the black child, I think, too, in these terms, and at ourselves in these terms. Often then, in order for us to be dominated and ruled over by another people, we often then must have suffered either from some internal problems and conflicts, or have run into some confrontation with a so-called superior force, or a combination of one or more of these factors and other factors I have not mentioned. We see on the historical scene, for instance, the classic Punic Wars, the wars between Rome and Carthage, where Rome saw its dominance in the world and power and influence in the world as being blocked by that of Carthage, and it decided then in a way to destroy Carthage's power and therefore stand alone as the most influential nation in the world, or empire in the world at that time. When we look then at the advanced development of this black child, we have to also look at the Europeans' attempt, successful so far, to dominate the world scene. The European has brought that domination to a good extent by seeking to retard and reduce or destroy or distort in some way the potentials of black people. When we look then at this healthy and endowed and gifted black child, as it suffers in our schools today, we see the process then of a dominant power seeking to retard or destroy or distort the potentials of our people. In the interest of Eurocentric and other nationalistic groups, in the interest of their domination and exploitation of African peoples, the potentials of African people have been retarded, reduced, destroyed, or misdirected. And you're going to see that most clearly in the behavior of the children as such. European power and alien exploitation of African people is founded on what I've referred to as several European constants. Have indicated on a number of occasions that despite all of the changes that we have been witness to over the past 20 or 30 years since the so-called 60s, the so-called assimilationist changes, the integration of lunch counters, the admission of blacks into colleges, the integration of schools, the election of black mayors, and on and on and on we go. There are some things that have not changed. And as much as I support the election of Jesse Jackson, there will still be some things that the European will attempt to hold constant. To a good degree, the movement of black politicians into so-called power has, I think, paralleled the development of neo-colonialism in Africa. I don't think it's a mere coincidence that blacks are so-called achieving political power within this country at the same time or in parallel with the achievement of neo-colonialism in Africa. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, sometimes the more things change, the more they remain the same. In some instances, I've indicated that really, if whites had any sense, they would elect Jesse Jackson. Right. Because in a world of people of color, we're so used to being called minorities until we, as black Americans, tend to think of ourselves as minorities. And we forget that we are part of one of the largest majorities on this earth. And when we look around at this earth and look at the ethnic makeup of this earth, we would recognize, of course, immediately that the European is a minority in the world. And if some of you have been familiar with the recently published book called The Birth Dearth, it is predicted that the European population will shrink from its current about 10% to about 5% shortly after the year 2000. That even in the United States, by the year 2015 or 2030, whites will be a minority in this country. They will no longer be a majority in this country. And these are demographics, of course, that we as people should study and look at and see what they mean for us. In fact, I was reading here, if some of you read the Newsweek magazine, I believe it was, in February, when it talked about the Pacific Century. Some of you might have had an occasion to see it. I believe I have it here. And I recommend that you read it. It's Newsweek, February 22nd. The Pacific Century, is America in decline? A very interesting piece. Several articles were done on this particular subject. You know, the Asians have consciously started referring to this as the Asian century. They are already becoming conscious that the next century will belong to them in terms of influence. In a section in this particular magazine, I found very interesting that I want to, let's see if I can locate it right quick. I hadn't intended to look at it, but I'll just see if I can find it because I thought it was somewhat revealing. Anyway, because I cannot locate it right away. Oh, okay, here it goes. It says Asian immigrants who will number as many as 12 million by the year 2000 could affect America more profoundly than any group since the first boat people crossed over on the Mayflower. I hope you get the significance of that statement. The first boat people crossed over on the what? The Mayflower. In other words, the European is admitting himself that 12 million Asian immigrants will have more influence and impact upon the culture of the United States than even they had. And this was supposedly their country after they took it from the Indians. There is little mention, or in fact, there is no mention of the 30 or 40 million or more black people who will be in this country at that time. Are those people going to be without influence and without impact? Again, I find it interesting, as in the movie Star Wars, which many of you have heard me remark about many times before, that when Europeans and others project into the future, the black man is not there. He's not seen. I've remarked about that movie, and you've seen it, I'm sure, where the people who were flying the spaceships were not even human. They had animals, Chewbacca and the rest of it, and robots flying the spaceships. Blacks weren't even second in command. And in fact, they were not existent in the first movie at all, which implies again then, the next century, and perhaps the century thereafter, is certainly not seen as an African century. Something has to happen to the minds of black people if this is to be the case. The minds and personalities and culture and character of black people must and will have to be stunted and distorted and retarded and reduced if this is to be the case. If 12 million Asians are going to have more impact on this country than Europeans had on it, then the blacks must be virtually non-existent or invisible. It means then, in addition to being exploited by Europeans, we must then be further exploited by Asians and others. I think it was projected that somewhere in the next century, even the Hispanic population will outnumber that of the black population. What role then will we play in this nation? What role then will we play in this world? So despite the fact that we may be in various high visibility positions, such as many African leaders are in high visibility positions, our influence in the world may essentially still be nil. Because the European does not intend to give up his power easily. And even in this discussion here in Newsweek magazine, there is not a surrender by the European. Even though they're admitting the increasing power of Japan and of the other nations, they are still, of course, trying to figure a way out, a way of maintaining their power and their influence. They're working very hard in reviewing their military situation, their social situations, political and economic situations, to see if they can survive into the next century and maintain their dominance into the next century. They know, as Dr. Wellesley has pointed out very much, that they are a minority in the world. And in order to maintain their position, they must maintain certain differences between themselves and other people. I said it would be to their advantage to elect a Justice Jackson in a way, and I'm sort of using this analogously, in the sense that in a world of color, in a world where there are so many different nations of color, wouldn't it be a nice neo-colonial stroke of luck to elect a so-called colored man to represent the United States in that world and prolong white power for another few years? Unfortunately, I think the white power groups in this country will not even do that, but who knows? They've done it in Africa before, perhaps in America. We as people, though, must be alert to this possibility so that the election of someone like Jesse Jackson or some other black man will not serve the intended purposes of those who wield power in this country. In order to maintain then power in the world as a minority, the Europeans must maintain certain constants. They must maintain what we call a military differential. That is, they must maintain their military power. One of the problems that's plaguing this country and one of the problems that's causing its economic decline is that it must keep a vast military machine alive. It is literally overstretched in the world today. But it sees this as the only means of maintaining its position in the world. I was talking to a young man the other night, and he was defining war. We were talking about war, and of course he gave a very patriotic definition, a highfalutin definition, which of course a nice collegiate definition, you see. One of those definitions that blinds you. But I think it's very productive sometimes if we look at the relationship between nations in the world as a relationship between mafia gangs. You know, the other day they published these gangs, the John Johns and the Preachers groups and the this and that group up Manhattan and so forth, and how each of these groups struggle for territory and struggle for ascendance in various areas. And they are having wars, ladies and gentlemen. They're fighting over territory. They're fighting over turf. They're fighting over economic possibilities. Yet they are not defined patriotically in what they are doing. They are looked upon as criminals and thieves, which they really are. I'm not defending that. They go into a community like South Jamaica and other and tell the people, this is our territory. We don't care if you live here. We don't care if you rent here. We don't care if you raise your children here. This is ours. We're going to run it the way we feel like it, and you don't have a doggone thing to do about it. And if you get out of line, we're going to kill you and blow you away. How different is that from the United States activity in Central and South America and in the world over? Why is this called war? Why is this called patriotism? It's the same kind of game. It is a mafia racket. It is a struggle between gangsters, the Soviet Union, Western Europe, and others over territory and turf. And the people who occupy those territories don't have a damn thing to say about it. What difference does it make what these Nicaraguans will say? The United States says what? Central and South America belongs to us. And the Central and South Americans have not a doggone thing to say about it. The Russian says Eastern Asia belongs to us, Eastern Europe belongs to us, and this is our territory. And another group says this Southeastern Asia belongs to us, and this is our territory. We have the right to exploit it, and we have the right to keep you out, and if you try to get in, we're going to blow you away, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do that. But yet, you see, that's called war, and, people are made to hear great marching songs, and they'll give a great patriotic themes, but it's the same thing. What are American interests, in a word? You hear this phrase, we are there to protect American interest. Do you have any interest there? As a person, an individual, what are those interests? You will find, of course, that those interests are the interests of business persons and other people who are economically exploiting those areas and robbing the people. I'm reminded of a little phrase I sort of quipped off the other day, and I'm working on it now. Why are there so many poor people in the world, and why are there so many poor people in the United States? And this is again an issue with which you can wax eloquent and go into poor people's motivations and all of this other kind of thing. But essentially, I think it boils down to this. Poor people are robbed when you look at it. They've just had their wealth, stolen from them. They're poor essentially because they've just been taken, ladies and gentlemen. And they've been taken with delusive concepts such as private property. An illusion, not even a reality. There's no such thing called private property. But when you can get people to believe in it, then you can rob them. When the white man got the Indian to believe in the concept of private property, then the Indian was robbed. When the African started believing in private property, then the African was robbed. If you think there's such thing as private property, stop paying your taxes and see how long it stays yours. I don't care if you paid $1 million for it or $10 for it. You stop paying your taxes and see how long it belongs to you. It is not private property. You rent it. You see then a nation and a people starting out with property in common. If the soil is poor and the land is poor, the people are poor. And yet you see another people come in and convince them of something called private property. And you see the land being cut off. And you see someone saying, I have the right to go rich and heavy and cut you off and have you starve to death. You see them forced into wage slavery because they no longer can say, hey, I can determine when I'm going to go to work and how I'm going to work. And you can see this in the history because you see, I can go and fish, I can go and hunt because that's what we call a commonwealth. There's land that's common for all of us, and it's open to me to fish, to eat off, to feed my family off of, and therefore I maintain a certain amount of independence. But then in comes a nation with the concept of private property, and it wants to get the natives to work, and it wants them to work hard and steadily. And it then lays down the concept of private property. It encloses the properties. It says you can't fish without a license. You can't hunt without a license. You can't pay taxes in game and in vegetables and so on. You must pay taxes in gold. And how can I get the gold? Then you've got to come to work because we only pay you in gold and you got to give it back to us. And so you will see then a steady robbing of the people and taking away of the wealth of the people from a group of influential people who lay down nebulous concepts and get those people to believe in those concepts. So that in the end, the only thing a poor man can do is go and give up his life defending a rich man and think then that he is being patriotic for love of country. An amazing game is run. And so we see this kind of game going on. So we see then the European maintaining the power differential, the military differential, because that's his last stand. If all else fails, then there is always what? War. And if all else fails, then we then will go to war with Japan, or we'll go to war with someone else and win back, because we again look at the history of world wars and wars in the world, they often have been wars that have to deal with more or less economics. The constants, another constant is that what we call unending economic dependence. Despite our election to these offices, and we should elect our people to offices, do not get me wrong, but let us also recognize that there is still another program behind this. There is little or no intention for the European to remove us from economic dependence. As a matter of fact, those of you who studied the Brzezinski report during the Carter administration outlined in that report as a means of maintaining European economic dominance, it was stated very clearly, one of the means by which we will maintain our economic dominance, one of the means by which we will maintain a class stratification among African Americans, one of the means by which we will maintain a unreachable gulf between African Americans and African Africans is by electing black mayors, by giving black people certain key jobs in the economy, by raising black people to positions of status so that they will feel that they have a stake in a stake in the nation, and they will defend the nation. And in defending their stake as a part of the rising middle class or ruling class, they will defend us in the process. Very much a neo-colonial model. The African neo-colonial leader, in trying to defend his own shabby power and defend his own shabby status and his own money and so forth, defends his European sponsor. And this is the kind of game then we will have to watch, ladies and gentlemen. In other words, then, the dependence of African peoples upon Europeans economically is going to continue as far as the European is concerned. Another constant, of course, is that of European authority and prestige. That is to say, we still must look on Europeans as representing the ultimate authorities and the validators of truth. I've often remarked to my classes, isn't it interesting that if I say something to you, you have trouble believing it, but if a white man says it to you, you believe it right away. We tend to believe the people who lie to us most. But of course, in order for the European to rule, being the minority that he is, he must put people in a state of mind and consciousness where they have this tendency to believe him beyond all others. In writing our papers in college and schools, we can argue our points very well as long as we have some European authority backing us up. We're not too secure if there's an African authority backing us up. But as long as there's some white man authority, then we feel as if we're on solid ground. The European continues to control information and intends to control information. As a matter of fact, this country sees this major economic role in the future as that of processing information. And we know that people are ultimately created in terms of information. What you are today is to a great extent the result of words. What people have said about you, I have not said about you, and so forth. We know that the words creates consciousness, behavioral orientations, behavioral relationships with other people and so forth, and he who is in control of the word is often then in control of our orientations and our behaviors and self-perceptions. In fact, during that conversation I had with the young man about the war, his acceptance of the European definition of war, of course, placed him in a position where he could not see many things that should have been obvious. Place him in a position not to defend his interest. The fact that we let European name wars, for instance, World War I, World War II, this war, that war, makes us think that this is the only way we can classify wars. But we must recognize that we've been in wars with the Europeans for the last 2,000 years. And that war has been continuous and ongoing. And it is in our interest as people to name wars and depict wars and describe wars. We cannot leave the depiction and description of wars in the hands of other people. They will describe them in such a way that it will serve their interest. There's no intention for the European then to turn this kind of power loose. The control of definition is constant. The continuance of African degradation is a constant. So is the continuing of African cultural disunity a constant. In other words, I made a mention here of often that mental maladjustment in the African personality, just as the retardation in the development of the black child's mental and psychological abilities, they are necessary for the maintenance of European power and domination. In other words, you've heard me say many times rhetorically, in order for us to be in the position we are in, we have to be out of our minds. We have to be crazy. It is a political necessity that we be off-center and off-base. We are not merely crazy or maladjusted purely as a result of some negative relations we've had with our mothers or our fathers. Mental maladjustment is far deeper than that. In fact, we are crazy if we are because our fathers were crazy and our mothers were crazy and they were made crazy by the people who dominated them. And in order for this European minority then to dominate the world, it must keep the rest of the world in a state of deception and false consciousness. That is a must. This is where black psychology begins, particularly the black psychology of oppression. And we must look at it that way. Let's look for a minute at African degradation, the slander of the African personality, the slander of the African physiognomy, for instance. I've mentioned in other contexts that it was noted that we, as so-called 12% of the American population, buys almost 40% of the cosmetics produced in this country. Very interesting statistic there. 40%, nearly 40%, I think the figure was something like 34%. In other words, we keep the cosmetics industry alive and well. A good part of keeping the cosmetic industry alive and well undoubtedly is predicated on the fact that many of us do not feel naturally beautiful. Many of us have problems with our inherited African features. And we seek to cover up and distort those features and make them acceptable to European power in one form or another. And we spend a tremendous amount of money in doing so. We see, though, in this instance then, that if you have a cosmetics industry that is dependent upon a vague sense of ugliness in many of our people, a vague sense of dissatisfaction in many of our people with their natural African physiognomy, that industry is not about to let us get out of that state of mind. In other words, that state of mind is economically functional. When you look at the many maladjustments that we talk about in the African personality, you can see that those maladjustments serve economic functions. They serve political functions. They are not there by accident. They're not there merely because the white man hates us, or merely because the white man is racist. They are there because they serve very concrete purposes. And one of the most concrete purposes is that, of course, of economic dominance, and to which is related, of course, military dominance, cultural dominance, and almost any other form of domination you may think of. So consequently, then, the maladjustment in the African personality is not there by accident. It is maintained as such. It is in service of Eurocentric dominance and alien exploitation, and I'm including some other groups in here because it is not only Europeans that are exploiting African people, that the potential of the black child must be retarded, impaired, and misdirected. Just as when we look back in the destruction of black civilization, when we see that the rising of European dominance in the world required, in a sense, the destruction of African civilizations, we see again the rise and maintenance of European domination in the United States and in the world literally demands the impairment of black people's minds the world over. And this means then, despite the magnificent gifts that the black child is endowed with by nature, those gifts must be destroyed, distorted, or impaired or misdirected in order to maintain European power. Consequently, a set of modal African personalities, that is, a set of African personalities must be created to serve the European interest, and conflicts within the African personality and the African community exacerbated and created and maintained to serve European interest. Except for those deeply rooted genetic and congenital areas of metabolism or other severe physiological conditions whose effects are irresistibly psychological, mental and emotional dysfunctions are founded in the nature of an individual's interpersonal and social relations. In other words, what I'm saying here, except where people may be crazy as a result of the fact that their brain isn't correctly wired up, or due to some other kinds of physiological problems and dysfunctions, mental and emotional dysfunctions are founded essentially in the nature of the kinds of relationships the individual has with other people. In other words, other people drive us crazy. We are made crazy by other people. Other people drive us crazy. The social, economic, and political agendas of the group and society in which we develop the emotional, cognitive, behavioral, and valuational character of the primary group, that is mother, father, siblings, relatives, and other significant persons with which we relate in meaningful ways, combined with our own inherited contribution to distort an identity that is called our personality. Another one of these irrelevant and vacuous concepts is that of individualism, which of course has caused more destruction in the black personality, in the black community, than anything else besides private property. The idea that there is such thing called an individual. There is such thing as a unique person who has no kind of relationship to other people. Your personality certainly is different from every other person's personality, but certainly there are many commonalities. Still, your personality, no matter how unique you may think it is still a social product. It is the and those interactions are a part of who and what you say you are. And when we look then at the identity of an individual, we are not only looking at the uniqueness of that individual, we are looking at how that individual uniquely represents the experiences and the relationships he's had with other people as well. The culture, the society, the primary group, with their agendas, problems, and conflicts, with their overwhelming, forceful, pervasive, and punitive attempts to rule and regulate our lives and to determine our reality, become incorporated in our bodies and incarnated in our minds. In other words, the efforts of this society to rule over our lives, the efforts of our relatives and other groups to create in us basic personality orientations, the political events that go on in the nation in which we live and in the groups with which we live are not only represented outside of ourselves, but represent themselves in our very bodies, in our very minds. In other words, our minds and our bodies are reflective to a great degree of the groups with which we interact and of the people with which we interact. Therefore, their problems become our problems. And this is one of the things we often have to point out to individuals. Often individuals come for counseling and they think, I'm the only one with this problem. Nobody else in the world is like I am. Nobody else is going through this thing. And one of the values of group dynamics and the values of group therapy is to get an individual to recognize that the problem he or she thought was so unique to him or herself is shared by many other people. And ultimately to get the individual to recognize many of the problems that he or she thinks are so unique to themselves really are political, social problems that are common to the community in which they are a part. And therefore these problems represent themselves individually, but they are not individually unique. The problems of our people become our individual problems. We identify with them. In us, the individuals, the public becomes private. The interpersonal becomes intrapersonal. That is, the external becomes internal. The social system, with its corresponding matrix of social field forces, surrounds and penetrates us, overruns our defenses, and sets up its headquarters company within the very nucleus of our personal cell. There it attempts and succeeds far more often than not to direct our most important activities and give meanings to our most important experiences. With due regard to the exceptions mentioned earlier, ultimately all individual madness is social madness. Individual sanity is social sanity. Because of European political, economic, cultural domination, a Eurocentric social field matrix surrounds the captive African and gives birth to his captive personality. The captive African inherits his captive madness from the Eurocentric social force field which fathers him. In other words, we are made to think that the European represents normality. But if we are out of our minds, if the world is out of its mind, it is because those that dominate this world at this time are themselves out of their minds. The greatest threat to life on earth today and to the sanity on earth today is European man. Right. The captive African is a Eurocentrically created creature. You've heard me say that time and time again. We are a created people. We are still struggling to be self-creating. We were brought here to serve the interests of another people, and it is still their intention at this very moment that we serve their interests, and it is their intention that we continue to serve their interests as far as we can see in the future. That intention has not changed, regardless of what may be going on in the nation today. In order to dominate African peoples without the use of intensive military repression, the Europeans must create an African personality or set of personalities, which is psychologically and morally compatible with Eurocentric dominance, which is fundamentally in contrast to the European so-called modal personality. The African personality must naturally and conveniently be what the ruling European needs it to be if their hegemony is to continue unbroken in its ascendance. In other words, I've stated before, if you want to know the personality of black children, if you want to look at the so-called deficiencies of black children and understand the deficiencies of black children, if you want to look at the deficiencies and problems in the black community and understand those deficiencies and problems, then answer the question, what deficiencies and problems must exist in the personality of our children and in our communities such that the Europeans can maintain dominance and power? And when you answer that question, you will see how the deficiencies are placed and why they must be placed within the African personality. If thinking clearly is a threat to European dominance, then we're going to have trouble thinking, ladies and gentlemen. If loving one another dearly and closely is a threat to European dominance, then we're going to have problems loving one another deeply and closely. If acting cooperatively with one another is a threat to European dominance and power, then we're going to have problems acting collectively in a sustained sense. I'm not talking about this reactionary type of cooperation we are very good at. I'm talking about proactive cooperative activity, which we still have yet to bring about. We're good at when we made mad coming together. When someone has hurt somebody or some bumpers has been shot up, and we should come together around those things. But it so happens often that after the noise and drama is over, everybody goes back their separate ways. I remember out in South Queens, out in Howard Beach, Queens, as a business person, I had a couple of good business days. A couple of good Saturdays. What were they called? Black buy days or buy black buy out? Yeah. Wouldn't it have been nice if those days had continued? You know, the problems of Howard Beach have not been solved. The problem of the attack on our people have not been solved. But somehow that event galvanized us for a moment or two. A reactionary event that galvanized us. What happens, though, to proactive galvanization? That still seems to be a problem within our community. Not one that is the result of an arousal of anger or arousal of insult or something like that, but one that is aroused because we are interested in advancing our own interests as people and enhancing our lives as people, not because we are reacting to an insult by another people as such. And therefore then we see that the European seeks to create the African personality and maintain that personality. And if then, as I said, these characters, thinking, collective behavior, proactive collective behavior, loving one another, cooperating one with the other, developing our technological expertise, gaining an African identity, and all of these things would represent a defeat of European power, then you will see our children and we ourselves as adults having problems in these areas. So when we talk about these problems in our personalities and in our communities, we must recognize then that they are politically mandated problems. In order then, as we said, to dominate the African peoples without the use of intensive military repression, the Europeans must create an African modal personality which is morally and psychologically compatible with Eurocentric dominance. The African personality must naturally and conveniently be what the ruling European needs it to be if their hegemony is to continue unbroken in its ascendance. The first step in the Eurocentric creation of the African personality needed to justify and support Eurocentric dominance is the Eurocentric projection of a stereotypical African imago, complementary and inferior to the stereotypical European imago. In other words, a part of the first step in creating the personality of the African that is supportive of European dominance is that of projecting what we call the stereotype of the African person. And of course, we're familiar with African stereotypes and stereotypes of African Americans such that we will not have to talk about those stereotypes. Such typical projections are used by the ruling Europeans to justify and rationalize the means by which they make into reality or bring into actual existence their projected and socio-politically functional African imagos. In other words, what starts out as a European lie, what starts out as just a European projection and illusion, becomes a reality through European activity. Wishful European thinking becomes an actuality. This is the same kind of process we talk about in the classroom. When a teacher has low expectations of black students, has a stereotypical view of black students, this stereotypical view does not fit the reality of those students. However, given that teacher's power and influence over those students, what was at one time visionary, what was at one time purely stereotypical, becomes real. In other words, the African child is taught to be dumb. We are made to be dumb. We learn to be dumb. As I've often said, if the European power depends upon the ignorance of black people, then European-dominated schools will create that ignorance. We will be educated into ignorance. We will be made stupid by our very education. The second step in the Eurocentric creation of the modal African personality is the Eurocentric creation and maintenance of social, political, economic, ecological, cultural conditions conducive to producing the desired African traits. Let me say it this way. It is no accident that there's job discrimination. It is no accident that we live under the kind of conditions we do. It is no accident that our history is rewritten the way it is written. It is no accident that our images projected through the media are projected the way they are, because these are the actual concrete means by which our personality is created, is made to fit the European stereotype. If we must be dumb people, if we must be ignorant people, not only, as I said, must we be made ignorant in the schools, the kinds of schools we go to must not be successful in producing a brilliant and intellectual and independently oriented people on their own. There then is no accident why these schools are designed the way they are. In other words, when a person has a stereotypical view of another individual, that view is not just a view alone. The person who holds that stereotypical view tends to behave in accordance with that view, to create the situations and the kind of relationship such that that stereotypical view comes into actuality. The teacher that has low expectations of the student, the teacher that has stereotyped students as learning deficient and retarded, will react and act toward those students in such a way that they will actually retard them. They will ignore questions, they will ignore answers through body language and other kinds of language. They will communicate to that child their stereotypical views. The child, in adapting to such behavior, ultimately often adaptively becomes dumb. The third step requires that the African accept as natural and inherent the Eurocentrically projected image of his personality as fundamentally accurate. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, in order for us to be in the condition we're in, we must believe lies. We must accept the lies and stereotypes as truth. And this is the major part of the equation. I've said on other occasions, it is not so much that the European is racist. It is not so much that the European has slandered the African personality. It is not so much that the European has miswritten our history and misinterpreted our culture, or has assaulted us physically and otherwise. It is our belief in what the European has said. It is our acceptance of the European projection of ourselves that is really the cause of the damage. In other words, if we did not believe it, if we did not have doubt in our personality, if we were not tempted by the Europeans' description of ourselves, what the European says and how the European attacks us would have little or no effect. To that degree, then, we, in a sense, participate in our own oppression. We have to become a part of our own oppression by believing and internalizing the things that have been said by the Europeans. Once that happens, then, we become allies in our own oppression. For the most part, the contemporary captive African is not despoiled of his mental and physical, personal, interpersonal, cultural, and geophysical potential by his European exploiters through the direct application of coercive force. Generally, the use of armed police, military force, of the forced labor in concentration camps, of chattel slavery, peonage, and serfdom to extract the captive Africans' wealth-producing resources and labor surpluses is viewed as passé and counterproductive. Perhaps more productive and certainly more socially acceptable, a more socially acceptable method of European exploitation of the captive African is the contemporary one whereby the African, the captive African, by dint of his own apparent volition, through his own apparent self-determined activity, coincidentally supplies his European exploiters with whatever physical and social products they would have otherwise they would have to take by brutal force. What I'm saying is this, that the European knows pretty much that he is not going to get from us the kind of exploitative wealth through the use of armed forces or through concentration camps. He must then seek to get through us and get to use us through a manipulation of our personality. This means, again, then, in our acceptance of the European personality, we must behave in such a way that we think that we are behaving according to our own volition. Thank you very much. And behaving according to our own volition, we inadvertently behave in such a way as to support the European power over us. In other words, then, when you talk to a black student, say, about dropping out, or you talk to some black person about buying here and buying there, they will often justify their buying from our white enemies, or justify their dropping out of school, or justify their support of European domination by stating that their behavior is an expression of their individual freedom. That their behavior is an expression of their own desires. I remember I was in a meeting one time, and one gentleman was complaining about how his daughter was being treated by her white playmates. He was living in an all-white neighborhood, and he was asking me, what must I do about it? And someone, of course, told him to move. But, of course, he then went into a defense of himself. And, of course, he went into a standard thing that we often go into. It is my right to live wherever I want to, and therefore I should do this and I should do that because it's an expression of my constitutionally given freedoms. While we cannot argue against that, it is interesting, though, often when we seek to express our individual rights, we express those individual rights in such a way that they support Eurocentric dominance. The white man's not moving into our community does not seem to make him feel as if he's somehow less free than we are. In other words, he doesn't seem to have a need to move into the black community to prove how free he is, to prove his individual freedom. However, we as African people seem to need to prove our freedom, and in proving our freedom, we often then, through our own will, end up maintaining our domination and our subordination. The personality that I was talking about here today, to retard and reduce the black child's tremendous potential. There is one thing that must happen. That is the separation of African people from their African selves, from their basic African identities. When you have an identity it is difficult for another person to impose a set of values on you. Because having a positive identity and a solid identity is a defense against being penetrated by alien forces. A positive identity functions to locate us in the world, in space and in time and in history. A positive identity gives us a sense of purpose and a sense of direction. A positive identity provides us with self-knowledge and direction. A positive identity provides us with a sense of belongingness. When we say we are African, we are not merely identifying ourselves as individuals. We indicate that we belong to a people, to a culture, to a nation, that we belong to a system of values, a system of perceptions, a system of behavior, folkways and mores. A system, an identity permits us to cooperate with other people. It permits us to understand what role we must play within a particular group. An identity permits us to know our own interests. An identity permits us to provide ourselves with an evaluative system, permits us to evaluate what is going on in the world. An identity provides us with a defense against possession. I've often said that we cannot be African and be slaves and subordinates of other people at the same time. We cannot be fully identified and at one with our African identity and be subordinate to another people. The European, of course, recognized this immediately. That is why when we talk about our slave history, we often talk about the destruction of African culture. We talk about the rewriting of black history as an attempt again of destroying the African culture and an African personality. We recognize that the destruction of that personality, the separating of us from our culture, the separating of us from our history, is a separation of us ultimately from our identity. It means a split and a schism is created in the personality. When a schism and a split is created in the personality, the individual is made exceedingly uncomfortable. It is the first rule of brainwashing. When you wish to brainwash a person, when you wish to transform their personality, you break them from their old personality. You break them from their old moorings. You make them question and doubt their previous culture and their previous learning. When you get them to begin to doubt themselves, when you get them to reject their culture, when you get them to see their past lives as negative, when you get them to feel ashamed of that past life, when you get them to feel guilty of that past life, and any good brainwasher knows this, and you check out the Moonies and any other brainwashing organization, you will see this process being put forth. Once you get that, the individual then is left in a tremendous state of confusion, in a tremendous state of ambivalence. That state is painful. It motivates the individual then to seek some kind of relief, to seek some way out. Then it becomes the function of the brainwasher to say, if you follow my way, if you accept my definition, if you do it the way I say do it, if you look at it the way I say look at it, if you value it the way I say value it, then you will feel better. See how happy we are. You know, often in these quasi-religious brainwashing places, you see the people running around smiling, and they're all glory, and they're all happy, and they're all loving, and they're all, and here's this confused person cut off from family, cut off from his community, cut off from everything he's known, and is filled with pain, and yet these people seem to be so loving, they seem to be so brotherly, they seem to be so sisterly. Then let me get what they have. And of course these people are here to say, see, if you thought the way we thought, if you look at things the way we look at it, you'll be happy, you'll be one, you'll be accepted. Then often the individual then accepts the values and the orientation of the brainwashing group and then becomes a part of that group. The splitting then of the African personality is a necessary process in inculcating into that personality an alien personality, an alien spirit, creating the personality of servitude. It makes possible then in that African personality, that is the split African personality, makes it possible then for the African to begin to believe the lies, to accept the European distortions, to accept European reality, to accept then the stereotypes the Europeans have projected. And it's very interesting as you ride the subways today, and it becomes an embarrassing event to watch our youngsters use the degrading term they use again and again, so loudly, so unself-consciously. When I grew up, the idea of using this term in public, the idea of letting white folk hear you using that term, letting any other group of people hear you referring to yourself by that term, was unbelievable. But now this seems to be the coin of the realm. And we hear it all the time. Yeah, that nigga did, that nigga that. And, it just goes again and again and again. People must have been destroyed in many ways to talk about themselves in public and to be this way so loudly and so clearly. You must then break the African person from his African identity in order for this to happen. And this, of course, is what happens. Nature abhors a vacuum, we say. In other words, where there's a vacuum, there's an attempt for that vacuum to be filled in some way or another. And of course, we see that when we suck sodas with a straw, we create a vacuum, of course, and that vacuum sucks into it whatever we are drinking. When you create a vacuum in the personality by separating the African personality from its African identity, then there is an attempt for that personality to suck into itself something else, to fill its emptiness. When the European then is in control of information, when the European is in control of so-called knowledge, when the European is in control of so-called reality, in control of definition and so forth, it will be these things that are sucked into the African personality. When the European projects lies as truth, there will then be these lies sucked in through the vacuum of the split African personality and accepted as truth. And then this personality, these sucked in lies, these sucked in perceptions, these sucked in distorted views of reality will take on a life of their own. They will take on a structure and an organization and represent themselves as a personality. At that point, the African personality becomes possessed by a spirit. When we hear, as I said earlier, about the black boys and our children talking that language on the subway and speaking the way they speak, in a way it is not they who speak. It is the spirit in them that speaks, using their mouths, using their bodies. When they then believe the lies that they cannot learn as well or better than any other people, when they are afraid to try, when they are afraid of failure, when they are afraid of success, when they are afraid to challenge the European. You see, we talk about racism, but I don't think we are yet really ready to do something about it. Because doing something about it in the ultimate sense means preventing and neutralizing the perpetrators of racism. Ultimately, it means, ladies and gentlemen, removing the Europeans' ability to perpetrate racism in the world. Not getting the European to love us, not getting the European to so assimilate with us or to accept us, but getting the European in a position where no matter how scandalous he is in terms of us, he can do a doggone thing about it. Because we then have the power in and of ourselves to defend ourselves against his insult and against his slander. Ultimately, then, the removal of racism for the world would mean the ultimate neutralizing of European power. But many of us are not ready yet to take on that task. Many of us are still afraid that we are not up to that task, that we cannot defeat the European, that we cannot neutralize the European. So we have opted for some kind of armistice, some type of suing for peace, some type of getting along, because we figure that is the best that we can do. Then in this sense, then we will be continued to be possessed by an alien spirit. And that alien spirit then will speak to us. When we then fail to believe in ourselves as people, it is because that spirit has taken over us, and it says to us what the European has said: you can't succeed. You can't run the world on your own. You're incapable of having a culture. Without us, you wouldn't have VCRs. You wouldn't have TVs because, see, you're not technical, and you know you love it. You wouldn't have compact disc, and you know you're into your music, you see, and you wouldn't have this, and you wouldn't have that. Europeans are mathematically gifted, and you are not mathematically oriented, and Jews can count money, and you don't know how to keep money. That means that there's a spirit in us, and that spirit whispers to us, and it keeps us from attempting many of the things that we should attempt. This can only occur when we have been separated from our African selves. The alienated African then lacks insight and clear, realistic vision of himself and of the world, and finds himself at a loss as how to extricate himself from servitude and damnation. In other words, as long as we accept that alien spirit in ourselves, we will be confused as to how we are going to get out of our situation. Today, we see a lot of confusion in terms of the education of black children. A lot of gnashing of teeth about how we're going to educate these children. To a good extent, this is the result of our lack of insight into ourselves, our lack of understanding in a deep sense of our history as people. Our history has been one not only of where we have been enslaved or discriminated against and so forth. Our history has been one where, as I said, there's been an implantation of an alien spirit, but it's also been one where our mental and other capacities have been retarded and held down or distorted in some sort of way. We can look at the history of our people as one massive and long period of brainwashing. And I think it should become very productive if we look at it that way. Being enslaved, being discriminated against, and so forth, creates a mentality. And once that mentality has been created, we were emancipated. But we were emancipated and made free because we would be free only to do the wrong thing. In other words, we often are free to make choices because those who have alienated our personalities know that when we make our choices, in most instances, we will make choices that work against our own interests and in the interests of those who rule and dominate us. When we look at the school situation then, we must recognize that these schools are predicated and built upon what I call the implicit child, the implicit white child. When you sit up and try to determine how you're going to educate, when you're going to educate a child, at what time certain courses are going to be offered, you have in the back of your mind or in your consciousness the developmental progress of that child, so that you can say, well, the child is ready to learn this at that time. The child's behavioral orientation will permit this kind of learning. The child, and it will permit the child to stay in class this long. We can teach this at this time because of certain developmental milestones have been reached, or the child's characteristics are such and such at this point and such at that point. Therefore, this educational experience can be allowed and indulged in. The educational system in which our children now are immersed is a system that is based upon the psychology of that of the white child. And therefore, we must recognize that that system is completely out of sync with our children. The system has built into it an automatic failure mechanism. And consequently, then, there is little wonder that our children fail in these schools as often as they do. And we'll have to look at that as we further discuss education. When we look at black-on-black crime, we see the operation of internalized racism. One black man operating against another black man the way a white man operates against a black man. To a very great extent, the criminal black man is the creation of the criminal white man. He acts out the attitudes of whites against his very own. The black criminal is often an ally of the white criminal personality. I've said in other instances that these whites, as they talk about drugs and so forth, will not remove drugs from the black community. We have such futile discussions going on now about ending drugs and about the war on drugs. It's a waste of time. It It's not going to be solved by white men, ladies and gentlemen. The only people who are going to solve drug problems will be black people. The only people who will solve the problem of criminality will be black people in this country and in this world, ladies and gentlemen. Amen. Why? One of the reasons why, ladies and gentlemen, is that the white man needs for the black man to be criminal. That's right. Come on. White civilization is based upon the criminalization of black men and of black people. I've stated in another context, why is it that every black man, regardless of his moral or ethical standings, regardless of his innocence, is seen and perceived as a criminal? Why is it that he almost always has to prove his innocence, particularly to the other people? That must mean then, if this is the case, that there is a need in the other people to see us as criminal. They're seeing us as criminal, whether we are criminal or not, must then meet some psychological need within their personalities. And therefore, the criminalization of the black man is a necessity because it serves European power and dominance. The putting of nearly 500,000 black men in the prisons of this country is a very, very important situation in preserving European and white power in this nation, ladies and gentlemen. Because the European, knowing that if these men were free in the true sense of the word, if they had the true use of their minds and the true use of their bodies, if they had a true African identity, if they were truly connected to their people, the jig would be up for European man in the world today. And therefore, the criminalization of the black man becomes a necessity for European power. And perceiving the black man as criminal becomes a necessity of European power, because it justifies the mistreatment of black men. It justifies the segregation of black people. It justifies many of the hideous crimes committed against the black community in the name of controlling crime. It also justifies the European ego and helps the European to define himself as being somehow morally pure and morally and ethically superior. And he can then look at himself in contrast to the black man. And therefore he needs the black man as a part of his own self-definition. As long as the black man is involved on black crime, he then will not have time to engage on what must be his true mission, the overthrow of European domination. As we've often said, then, you see, our attention must be diverted. As I said once in the psychology class, why do so many black men kill other black men? It is because they have not yet decided to kill white men. And that's the ultimate truth. That is the ultimate truth. The cowardly black man has not yet decided to really deal with his true enemy. And he displaces his frustration, and he displaces his cowardice upon his own people. And he attacks his own, and he uses his own, and he abuses his women, and he uses his children, and he terrorizes his community. Oh, he's great and bold to take out a gun and blow away some other black man's brain. But he has yet to take up the gun and blow out the brain of his true enemy. He'll march around the world and shoot some Vietnamese and shoot some other man, but he won't take up the arms against his true enemy. He can only then prove his boldness by an attack on his own and by a destruction of his own. I do not see a common black criminal as a revolutionary, because the common black criminal has the same motivation as the white middle class and the white ruling class. They're the same thing. They're striving for the same thing. The white middle and ruling class got a BMW. He wants a BMW. So if it means selling poison to our children, he sells poison to our children. If it means terrorizing the black community to get the BMW, he's going to terrorize the black community to get. In other words, He approaches his world thieving, stealing, and killing in the same way his psychological father approached the world, thieving, killing, and carrying on. Everywhere this man has stepped in the world, there's been thieving and killing. The black criminal is but an imitator of his psychological white father, ladies and gentlemen. And therefore we have black-on-black crime. And that black-on-black crime is a necessity for European power. I have stated then it is not the intention of whites to remove crime in the black community. It is only their intention to contain crime to the black community. You talk about the corruption of police. It is easy to corrupt a policeman when he is guarding a people he does not care about. And when the corruption of that people maintains him or her in the position that they are in. So we must recognize it is going to be the policing of ourselves that will get us there. And the same thing is true about education as well. It is until we teach ourselves and our own children that our children will not be appropriately educated. Black economic development is something that we ourselves must engage in. I just want to make one statement. I'll wind it up here. I want to read just this piece I thought sort of interesting by Tony Brown in the Black American, called Racial Anxiety. Long ago, I arrived at the conclusion that the major socioeconomic and political problems facing black people were primarily due to a mental health problem. Africanized Americans were not born with a mental disorder, but shortly into arriving, were thoroughly socialized by white society into self-destructive behavioral patterns. I call it racial anxiety. It crosses all class and economic lines. Self-inflicted wounds are everywhere. Black Americans made about $30 billion in 1970, about $80 billion in 1973, $230 billion in 1986, and will earn over $900 billion in 2000. And the projection is that in 2000, when we make $900 billion, about 70% of black men will be unemployed. 70% of black women will not have a man. 70% of black children will be raised without a father. From these figures, you can see that our community deteriorates as we earn at an exponential rate. So we're getting rich and deteriorating at the same time. Many black teens are reading at a level below their grandparents. Education and hard work are perceived as whitey's thing. Manners and politeness are perceived as character flaws. Interesting. Older blacks are afraid of the black generation behind them. Blacks who succeeded professionally and economically are praised for leaving less fortunate blacks behind. Sort of reminds me of that piece in Black Enterprise, the 25 black executives. Is that the highest point to which we will aspire, ladies and gentlemen? To be number 2 men in white men's corporations? Why can't we praise those black men who succeeded independently in some way or another? They will only mingle with other blacks at MLK celebrations approved by white. Busing black children to white people fail both to educate them or make them acceptable to whites, but we insist on more busing. So it reminds me of the educational situation. The more money we've given to education, the worse the education has gotten. What's the solution? Put more money into the system. We hear it again and again. Maybe that's, but we insist on more, but maybe that's why 70% of black children prefer a white doll over a black doll. Black colleges have succeeded in educating 7 out of 10 blacks who attend. White colleges graduate 3 out of 10 blacks, are called failures and examples of segregation. And you still, that's like that question, what does Jesse want? What need do we have for black colleges? You hear somebody try to be dignified and asking that question and trying to be profound. And yet we can see that it is still the black college that is producing as against the white college. But somehow we bring into question the need for a black college. And in a way, we have yet to get some truly black colleges. Some black women want blue eyes and wear store-bought ones as a badge of honor. Blacks have carried out the most successful boycott ever conducted against black in business. We spend 95% of our $230 billion with the non-black. As I've often said before, when you walk down our avenues and you see sometimes a street that's almost 100% black, and yet the stores are literally 100% owned by another group of people, it is evidence of an alien spirit. When you are possessed by an alien spirit, you can only serve the masters of that spirit. In other words, people possessed by the devils, those devils which possess them, serve the devil, their master. When you let another people introject a spirit into your personality, when you believe other people's lies, when you let them be responsible for the primary education of your children, when you let them be the primary source of your information about yourselves and who and what you are, then your spirit will serve those people. We can only then support aliens economically because we are filled with an alien spirit. The process of alienation then is a process of preparing people to serve those who alienated them in the first place. To wash our hands clean, it says about 150 black organizations spend $3 billion for annual conventions at white hotels discussing white racism and black poverty. I find it very ironic. To wash our hands clean, we blame white people and Ronald Reagan for the broken black family, high unemployment, illiteracy, drug abuse, poor weather, and bad breath. So then, to sum it up, what am I saying here? I'm saying the black child is a gifted child, is a child that is second to none, is a child that represents in a beautiful way the firstness of black people in history and in time. I am stating then that that gift is marred by the Eurocentric attempt to maintain his or her domination in the world, and by our refusal as African people to identify ourselves as Africans and to project that African identity. It is necessary then, given this line of thought, that our first efforts at reclaiming ourselves as a people and advancing our power as a people must lie in the reclamation of our African identities, to accept the reality of our Africanness. I've stated that one of the measures of mental illness is the degree to which the individual is separated from reality. In reality, whether you want to admit it or not, we are African people. Whether you seek to hide behind abstractions such as I am an American, or I am a human being, or I am a person who happens to be black, or I'm a person who does not see color, it doesn't matter if you hide it behind those kind of abstractions, you are still African. Simply because you refuse to see color does not mean the other people don't see you as color. And we have some people who are idiotic enough to think that. If I refuse to see the world as color, and if I refuse to look at myself in terms of color, then other people will refuse to do so. That is, it has no effect whatsoever. As a matter of fact, it makes the dominance of the other group even more powerful, because it cuts you off from reality. You cannot be in reality and deny your Africanness. And you cannot deny your Africanness and be in your right minds. And in order then for us and for our children to utilize their tremendous potentials, to develop their tremendous gifts, they first of all must reclaim their African identity. And we must give them back that African identity. And we must advance ourselves in terms of that identity. We must then recapture ourselves and love of self. We must build an African-based culture and moral values. We must set the goals of overthrowing white racist rule and the replacement of this with a new world order. We must set about building an African economy and technological power and political power. We must provide an education in truth and reality for our children and take over the educational system of our children. I don't think we have yet decided to do that. We must educate our own. We must take responsibility for policing our community and controlling and meting out criminal justice. We must set about building and providing housing and care for our own. We must establish an Afrocentric rehabilitative psychotherapy. What do I mean by that? It must be centered around the exorcism of the alienated spirit that lies within our breast. We must then provide an appropriate education for our children. We must provide economic autonomy as much as we possibly can. We ultimately must set about building a nation and a national economy. And ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, we must reclaim our African identity. Thank you very much for your attention and your time.
We want to thank Dr. Amos Wilson.
Good evening. Good evening.
My question is, how do I put protection around my child in school while I'm in confrontation with the administration?
Okay. You mean the administration of the school itself?
Yes.
Yeah.
And the school board and the parents association.
As a matter of fact, confrontation is, I think, one of the better ways of protecting the child. Because it's been my experience that parents who are constantly confronting the administration, confronting the teachers, asking questions, are part of organization of activities, get to a good extent their children dealt with more fairly and more honestly. That's not true in every situation, but I found that an active participation and an active concern about your children often moves the teachers to become actively concerned and actively involved in their education as such. That is one of the greatest means. Of course, knowing your rights and and knowing how to protect those rights and push those rights. Not being intimidated by teachers, knowing what the rules are, and being able to cite those rules and confront them with the rules. Then, of course, maintaining the appropriate kind of emotional and psychological relationship with your children, preparing them philosophically to withstand some pressures, because that is a part of the learning process as anything else is, getting them to expect some problems that may crop up and trying to prepare them to deal with it, of course, is a part of the education process. Training them how to protect their own interests as much as within their power, of course, is a part of the process as well. But letting the administration know and the teachers know that if your child is intimidated or is being unfairly dealt with, that they will have to deal with you, and they will be dealt with effectively, is, I think, one of the most effective ways of protecting the child.
Thank you, Brother Wilson, for your lecture.
Thank you.
My question is, what is the psychological and the psychohistorical implications of what happened to the young lady, one of our children, with the gang rape of the white men up in the Dutchess Falls? It seems that you're not clear about that. What is your view on what is happening as far as the people behind her, the attorneys and the others, and what is the psychological implications of that, since it seems to me it goes back deep into history? It just strikes me very awkwardly, very badly about this.
Yeah, this incident is really bringing out a lot of skeletons that many people had thought were hidden, and they would like to stay hidden. And it's interesting that the lawyers are accused of fomenting racism and racial conflict. I find that very amusing. But of course, that's a great tendency in this society to always turn things backwards and blame the victim, and to make some flaw in our personalities be responsible for our condition. So you see that same old psychology going on. It's Maddox and Mason who are responsible for racial problems and issues in New York City. And of course, those of us who are conscious would not accept that. For those of us who I talked about earlier, who still embedded with that alien spirit, you see, or still have that doubt about ourselves and our African personality, whose knowledge of the enemy is not very clear, then it will have the effect of creating confusion and motivating them to try to to hurry the case along or get rid of the case or to lose faith in those lawyers. I can't second guess their motives per se. The only thing I can say is that being who they are, being lawyers and so forth, I am going to maintain my faith in them. And I think that's the best I can do. I mean, because I'm not privy to what's really going on in that household with the fine points of the law and so forth. And I think second guessing them and so forth is sort of a disservice at this point. I'm willing to believe that they know what they're doing. Certainly a rape and a violation of the body of a woman or any person has very traumatic implications, depending, of course, upon her own psychological resources, which, again, I'm not familiar with because I never met her personally, I don't know her personally. But just generalizing, the tendency is, of course, to be very destructive to the personality of the individual. I think she did suffer a great deal from withdrawal. Often, of course, many a woman feels dirty, unclean, ashamed, guilty, and many other psychologically traumatic kind of feelings and emotions are being felt and experienced, and it usually takes quite a long time to get over those kind of feelings, if ever. Sometimes those situations are what we might call one-shot conditioning situations, where fear of other people, sometimes even a dislike of men, or at least a dislike of, or fear of white men or what have you, or men in general may develop. But these, again, are generalizations. Whether that's true in our case, I could not tell you. But this often happens in these cases. Many women today who are into drugs, or sometimes into prostitution, or into other kinds of promiscuous behavior, when we follow their history, have been women who've been abused sexually or psychologically in some sort of way. That is why it is so necessary for her to be supported by our community, for us to demonstrate our love for her profoundly, for her to achieve the right kind of psychological support and full psychological support that she needs at this point, because believe me, she is carrying a very, very heavy weight. Her case is also being used to indict the community, to again slander black women. You see the Post running a tremendous campaign in that regard to make us doubt her veracity and her truth. And it is not only her veracity and truth that's being doubted, it's ultimately the integrity of black women through her that is being attacked and dealt with as such. There's also the support by these newspapers and these distorted media accounts that the white man does not have to pay for an assault on black people and upon black women in particular. And that if a woman is assaulted, it must be because she herself in some way contributed to it or in some way brought it on herself. That is why we cannot let them off the hook. We must support this case fully and prosecute the people fully. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wilson. I have a few short questions. Number one, since we've never seen in this country the Catholics send their children to a synagogue to become good Catholics, or the Catholics sending their children to the synagogue to become good Catholics, why is it in the past black people have trusted the white people to educate their children? That's the first question. The second one is, since we now have a chancellor who is appointed by a white man who is a definite racist against any black person of any color or any person without any money, why should we be trusting this black man, and what are our chances of our children getting better education, although the billions that are going to still be spent are being spent right now in schools that are deteriorating with maybe a 10% of the school population with a 70% educational level at a certain level of English and math. These children are finished. I'm in a school where there's 3,200 children, and less than 10% of them have passing grades to even take the Regents examination. But they're going to spend $120,000 putting lockers in the school for them to put their clothes in. So these are the questions that I'm asking, not for myself so much, because I'm seeing it out front. But what are your interpretations of those facts? Thank you.
Okay, yes. As I indicated earlier, and that we are a creative people, and of course the attempt is to create us as people. And a part of we must recognize that every institution in this society, be it the educational institution or what have you, it has one major goal, and that of course is to maintain the status quo. As Paulo Freire stated very clearly, it is an illusion to expect the oppressor to give the oppressed a liberating education. And of course, as a part of maintaining their oppression, the oppressed, in a sense, maintains education. Education is a part of the process of maintaining itself in power. And a part of, and we accept this in the sense that we are often made as black people to feel that we are incapable of educating our children, that whites somehow can provide them with the best education. And often when we even find that there's a black school that may provide our children with a better academic education than a white school, we find many times our parents will still take the children out because their major concern is acceptance by white people. And I've said often, I think sometimes in our earlier so-called school integration drives, the thrust of that drive was not so much for education, but was for integration, to have our children accepted by whites. So the idea is then if they went to school with white children, if they participated in the same kind of activities with white children then would come to accept them as they accept themselves. They would look beyond their color, and we would at last be accepted without regard to our colors, and therefore we would then have escaped our oppression. So you still then have many of our parents motivated by this kind of drive, this motivation for acceptance, and this belief in the superiority of whites, and believing then that if these so-called superior people were to educate our children, then we then would become a part of their own situation. We must look at the Board of Education, I think, as a giant business. I've said in other contexts, for instance, it does not pay to look at the criminal justice system as a system meting out justice. Every institution, if given the current organization of the world, in relationship to black people, must act the opposite of its name. In other words, the prison system must make criminals of black men. The health system must keep us sick. The economic system must keep us poor. And you will see this reversal. When then we look at education, as I said earlier, must keep us dumb if being dumb is necessary for maintaining white power. The justice system must be unjust if it is to maintain white power. This is the way it is designed. This is the way it must be. Why do these people hang on to the Board of Education? And a system that spends from $4 to $6 billion will make a lot of people rich. The concern then is not the education of black children, but the allocation of that money. And the seeing that money is allocated and conduited into the white community and away from the black community. We often, as black people, I think, tend to be very naive. We take these organizations at face value, and we assume that because it's called the Board of Education, that's what it is concerned with. And yet, if we recognize, and look at how we elect our politicians. Often our politicians run on welfare planks and run on food stamp planks, and how they're going to get us food stamped and this and that. And yet, if you really ran candidates for that Board of Education, and really got control of the Board of Education, and really got control of the purchasing office in the Board of Education, and the contract letting Department of Education, you wouldn't have to run on food stamps. Because you could take that $4 to $6 billion and give it to your own contractors, and fix up those schools yourself, and conduit the buying of chalk and all that stuff into your community, and bring that wealth into the black community, you see. But we don't look at education, and besides doing that for the community, we can also educate our children. I'm willing to look and see what Mr. Green is going to do. I'm not going to prejudge him at this moment, even though I do have some doubts about education in America. I have yet to really hear what his program is. I get a lot of biographical statements about him, but I have not heard what his educational program is. I can believe, though, if it's a true educational program to liberate African people, he probably would not have gotten the job in the first place. But let's wait and let's see. I was reading his biography in the Village Voice last week. I see he's very comfortable with American corporations, and he plays golf with all the businessmen. He's already talking about bringing the corporations into the schools. I'm very leery of that approach. It's the same old prepare them for wage slave labor as the old systems used to be and covered over. And sometimes we have to be very careful about what success is, because often success is an indication of our failing. And if we're going to let success be measured by the number of jobs our kids get in these corporations, I don't think then we would have succeeded in the way that we should succeed. Next question.
Yeah, Doctor, thanks for the information. I have three short questions. What in teaching history, there's a certain kind of perspective that is given, and I'd like you to speak to the failure of, in teaching social sciences in particular, a slant is presented, and I'd like you to speak to that. What is the failure of history, of the method of teaching history? What is left out? Okay. The second thing is, what are the implications of Jesse Jackson becoming presidency? Becoming the president? What would that lead us into? Pros and cons, positive and negative. And the third one, I don't want to step on the sister's corn, but what would it take for black women to stop processing, dyeing, and straightening their African hair?
Okay. I think I'm going to let the African woman answer that. But I think history is incorrectly taught and not fully taught. Ultimately, I think history, to a great extent, should be taught outside of the school, particularly as far as it pertains to our culture. We cannot let our cultural history really be fully in the hands of another people, because obviously those people are going to teach that history and project that history in a way that supports their own position in the world. And so that part of history, which is so important to our achieving our identity, should be our responsibility. You know, we talk about Egyptians. I think it's remarkable that when we saw the Egyptian temples, we recognized that the temples were not just places of worship, but really universities and places of education. And of course, and I can see that this church is similar in design to the Egyptian temple, in the sense that it is not merely a place of worship, but a place of education, community development, and so forth. I think then when it comes to the teaching of cultural history, we should have our temples all over the nation that teaches the history. I think one of the problems with history, because a lot of times when people are discussing the education of black children, that's the first subject that's brought up. You know, we must teach them history and so forth. While I find that very important, I think we need to teach history at a greater depth than just events and just occurrences and just heroes. We must understand, as I've often said, that the psychology of an individual is the result of the history of that individual. In other words, who and what we are is the result of our history as a person. Who and what we are as people is the result of our history. That's the reason why I say that a black psychology is fundamentally different from a Eurocentric psychology, in that the Eurocentric psychology is based upon the history and experience of European people. So the psychology of black people is based upon the history and experience of African people. And therefore, to understand our psychology, we must understand our history. And to understand Europeans, we must understand European history. Not European psychology, by the way, but European history, because it is studying the activities of Europeans in history that you get your most clear understanding of what they are about and what their personality really is about. So in the same way, we should teach history such that we not only are cognizant of great events in our history and great heroes in our history, but history really is part and parcel of the process of self-understanding, of self-knowing, and of self-perception. And if we approach history that way, we will get to know reality. We will not only get to know ourselves, we will get to know our enemies, and we will get to know really what the world is about. And that's the kind of history we should. I said earlier too that the history of black people has been not only a history of discrimination and slavery, it has been a history of the actual shaping of the character of the black personality. If you're going to really appropriately educate black children, you must recognize how that history has impacted upon the way our children think, upon the way our children relate one to the other, upon how that history has destroyed or seeks to destroy their abstract abilities, their conceptual abilities, their ability to think in cause and effect terms, their abilities to use words and symbols, their linguistic abilities, their motivational abilities, how that history has restricted their imagination and their aspirations so that they don't think of themselves as masters and they don't see themselves as being educated to rule the world and to rule themselves, but see themselves merely as job seekers and employed people. This history then has created a mentality. These children come into the classroom with that mentality. A teacher who is not familiar with that history, a teacher who is not familiar with how that history has shaped the behavior and attitudes of those children, is a teacher that is going to miseducate those children, that is going to misperceive them and misevaluate them. And to a great extent, this is what has happened. When you look at I said earlier, for instance, if thinking abstractly is a detriment by black people, is a detriment to white civilization or to white dominance, you will see whites arranging our lives such that thinking abstractly is going to be impaired, that thinking conceptually is going to be impaired, that reading inferentially, reading in terms of implication, is going to be impaired, that relating past, present, and future will be impaired. Because all of these things are not just mental abilities, they are political abilities. They are abilities that, when used correctly, can be used in terms of power and overthrow. You see, now when you recognize then that the history of our people has been such that these abilities have been impaired, retarded, and reduced, you then get a sense of what your curriculum and your educational approach must be. The educational approach must be one then of restoring those aspects of the mental character and mental abilities of black people that have been taken by racism. You will recognize then that the education of black children cannot be a duplicate of the white child's education, because the psychology, the psychohistory of our people has created a type of mentality. Think about what a black child goes through when you talk about a black child, say for instance, speaking black English. You're telling that child then not only must it learn a new language, but it must unlearn an old language. Contrast that with a white child that walks into the classroom at the same time. If this black child has been robbed to a great extent of its ability to think through white paternalism, then you may have to spend 2 or 3 years just teaching what? Thinking skills alone. You can't sit around and look at how white people are teaching their children in order to approach your children. If the ability of our children to trust, and if we could trust in one another as black people, if we could love one another, cooperate with one another as black people, I said earlier, this would lead then to the overthrow of European power. Thus, these capacities must have been restricted and distorted in black children. This means then when it comes to educating black children, we must consciously educate them into cooperation. We must consciously educate them in terms of relying on another. Not something that occurs in the schoolyard, not something that is a part of some little game, but it must be actually built into the system. If our children have been robbed of their abilities to operate symbolically, It may be necessary, for instance, for us to give the first 3 or 4 years of their life to training in symbol usage, because we have to recognize one thing, ladies and gentlemen. Often what is seen as a math defect, as an inability to do math, is really often a problem with language. It represents the student's inability to translate a word into a mathematical expression. And therefore, before you put that student into math, you may then develop his linguistic powers and his symbolic powers, which means then that you may defer the teaching of math, if you wish, for maybe 2 or 3 years until language is taught and symbol usage is taught. When you do that, it is quite possible then for that student to do 2 and 3 years of math within 1 year. But you've got to throw out standardized tests. You got to throw out the concept of equal education. You got to throw out the concept of standardized education. In other words, when it comes to the education of our children, we must throw every concept up for question that we have accepted unquestionably, ladies and gentlemen, and reorganize that system in terms of our children. It is our children who are in these schools now, and we must then reorganize the educational system in terms of their history and in terms of their psychology. Jesse Jackson, like any other person, I think, will have his election to the presidency can have, of course, both good and negative effects. It can have the effects, as I alluded to earlier, of continuing to delude us as people, to making us believe that we actually have arrived at the pinnacles of power. It can make us have false hope that somewhere in the future we will be ultimately accepted as one in this culture. And that, of course, would be dangerous because we would not have sought to develop power independently. On one hand, it may enlarge the aspirational levels of our children. It may enhance, in some instances, their pride and outlook on themselves. It may, if we correctly use our power and influence, advance our political and social interests. The symbolism of Jesse Jackson for black people is not left to Jesse Jackson and should not be left to white folk. How Jesse Jackson will symbolize himself to us still should be our problem primarily and should be left to us as people. In terms of black women and the doing of their hair, to a great extent, one's definition of beauty, one's definition of beauty is a power and a political definition. In other words, it is people who are in power, people who are in economic and political control. Those people and their characteristics are often seen as desirable characteristics. And one of the better ways, I think, then, of getting our women to change their concept of beauty, of course, is to increase our power and our position in the world as black people. And this would lead to a further acceptance of our own selves as people. And of course, ultimately, the training of our children in terms of ethnic pride and ethnic identity will also begin to change the nature of this orientation. But it's going to take a while, particularly as long as the power is what it is. Yes, sir.
Dr. Amos Wilson. I'm curious to know something about what was going on in the 70s. I ran across an old booklet, Black's Book Bulletin, which was dedicated to the black psychologists at that time. I think it was Naeem Akbar, Francis Cress Welsing, yourself, and Bobby Wright. Now, in the early 80s, I used to hear Dr. Ben talk a lot about Bobby Wright and the concept of menticide. And last year, I was able to get hold of a tape by Bobby Wright in which he was dealing with his work, psychopathic racist personality. I want to know, did you know Bobby Wright? Did you have any affiliation with Bobby Wright? And what did you feel about his position in terms of his thesis, the psychopathic racist personality, which he felt in terms of the relationship between whites and non-Europeans, that this was genetically based, and he felt that the only solution was violence. And then I've heard another presentation of his dealing with A View from the Bridge, in which he was quoting Chancellor Williams' work in the relationship of whites to white folks to non-Europeans from 4,500 BC up to the year 2000. He felt that the Negro leadership in terms of trying to deal with these people through integration and through moral persuasion, or schizophrenic and so on and so forth? What did you feel about it?
I believe that I unfortunately didn't get a chance to meet Bobby Wright because of his his early death. And I'm sure had he lived even a year or two longer, I would have, because I was in Chicago a great deal during that time, and I didn't get a chance to meet him. And I think it was some great tragedy that he died as early as he did, because he was certainly doing great work, and certainly I think he was going to do much greater work still along the line. I find, of course, what I've read of him and heard of him, that our positions and orientations are quite similar and parallel. But I do think that once you get the Afrocentric view, and you start looking at things from what I call the Afrocentric perspective, there is a parallelism that runs in the work of people, whether it's psychology, sociology, economics, so forth. There is a built-in logic to the Afrocentric point of view and a orientation that once you get it, you'll find those of us, Wright, of course, Akbar, many of the others, going along pretty much the same line of thought.